What if the smallest detail in your life, the thing you would never even notice, was actually the moment everything started falling apart? Because sometimes it is not the overdose, not the arrest, not the breakdown that changes a person. It is a broken sandal, a drop of blood, and one brutal instant when reality stops letting you look away. And once you hear how that happened, the whole conversation gets a lot more disturbing. A broken flip-flop on Skid Row is such a brutal image. Like your life cannot hide from you at that point. And the crazy part is he said that was the moment he actually woke up. Sometimes reality does not send a softer email. But hold on, was it really one moment or just the last straw? I think it is always a pile-up, and then one image finally breaks you. Right, the broken sandal becomes the therapist. That's the ugliest intervention ever. But that detail about blood on his hands is what hits hard. It is not abstract anymore when your body starts looking like the damage. And he said he used to think of those street people as someone else. That part is terrifying because that is how identity collapses. Also, people act like addiction is just bad choices and vibes. No, there is usually trauma, neglect, access, and then chaos. He said his dad left early and his mom was working nights. That kind of absence shapes a kid way more than people admit. And then he is smoking weed at 8 or 9 with older kids. That is not rebellion, that is a system failing in real time. Still, I always wonder where the line is between pathology and habit. The line gets erased when nobody protects the kid. He basically grew up in the free trial version of disaster. Free trial with no cancel button. What I cannot stop thinking about is the mom calling with cancer. That is the kind of moment that would destroy a lot of people. Because then it is not just your life you ruined, it is your family too. He cried because he wanted to help her and could not. That is such a clean version of rock bottom. But I do not buy the clean version completely. What do you mean? I mean, rock bottom is usually ugly again, then one honest second. So basically, emotional junk drawer behavior. Exactly, everything is in there and nothing is organized. And then Penny connects him to Bob Forrest for rehab. I love how the thing that sounds fake is the thing that is real. Yeah, life loves a character named Bob Forrest. But that is also the point. Recovery usually starts with one person making a bridge. Nobody climbs out alone in a cinematic way. What do you think actually changed first for him? Belief or behavior? Behavior, then belief, then more behavior. You think so? Yeah, because when your life is that broken, hope is not enough. Hope does not pay for rehab or pants. True, hope is very weak in the financial department. He says he made a pact with God that he was going to be rich. That is such a wild sentence, but also very human. Some people would call that delusion. And some people would call it a survival promise. The difference is whether you wake up and do the work. Exactly, because then he said he worked himself into the dirt day and night. That obsessive energy matters, though. It matters until it starts eating you again. Right, the same engine that destroys you can also build the company. So addiction gets a corporate rebrand? Dude, that is annoyingly accurate. But there is a real distinction between compulsion and discipline. Do you think high performers are just addicts with cleaner calendars? A lot of them would hate that question because it is uncomfortable. It is uncomfortable because it is slightly true. The healthy version is when obsession gets tethered to something meaningful, like health, service, family, building something stable. And his business doing 34 or 35 million is insane. From homeless on the street to that kind of scale is ridiculous. But people hear that number and skip the boring middle. Exactly, they want the miracle, not the years of repetition. They want the glow-up montage without the suffering. Just play the music and skip the relapse scenes. Yet the real lesson is probably responsibility, not inspiration. How so? Because he stopped saying life happened to him and started acting on it. That is the hard part people hate. Everyone wants healing to be tender and poetic. Meanwhile, it is usually paperwork, pain, and showing up. That is the least Instagrammable truth ever. And I do think his ability to connect with top people comes from that authenticity. Because he knows what real collapse looks like? Yeah, people can feel when someone has survived something for real. It changes the way you speak to rooms. Though some founders just learn charisma and call it wisdom. That is definitely a species. Very common in Austin too, probably. But his story has enough pain that I would not reduce it to branding. What do you think the younger generation should take from it? That the direction of your intensity matters more than the intensity itself. That is actually a crazy good line. Write it down before the algorithm steals it. Seriously, because young people have plenty of drive. They just need fewer fantasies and more accountability. But do you worry that stories like this become too heroic? Yeah, because hero stories can erase the people who did not make it. And they can make pain look marketable. Still, does it help when someone says, "I was broken and I changed"? It helps if it makes one person take the next step. That is probably the only honest metric. Not the follower count, not the keynote speech. Definitely not the keynote speech. What stays with me is how close he was to disappearing entirely. Yeah, and then one day he just refused to stay that person. That refusal is almost the whole story, isn't it? Pretty much, because recovery starts when denial gets too expensive. And apparently his bill was enormous. Brutal, but yes. Anyway, that is why the story lands, because it is not polished. It is survival turning into purpose. And that is way harder than just sounding inspirational. Way harder and way more interesting. All right, that is the good kind of messy story. The flip-flop detail is insane, like your life is literally falling apart on your feet. And the sockless philosophical crisis is happening in a turtleneck in July. That is such a Los Angeles disaster scene, man. But that moment of clarity feels real, not cute. It is not some movie speech, it is just panic finally becoming honest. Like, oh no, I am actually one of the people I used to avoid. That hit me harder than the drugs part, honestly. Because the shame is almost the real rock bottom, right? Yeah, the drugs are loud, but shame is the thing that traps you. And then he calls Penny like, "Please save me from my own life." The universe really does send back weird phone calls at the worst time. What I cannot get over is he still had enough awareness to ask for help. That is the hinge, because most people wait until they are fully gone. He stopped at being mostly gone, which is, I guess, progress. Mostly gone is a terrible slogan, but a great recovery start. I keep thinking about how early the addiction started, too. 8 or 9 is not experimentation, that is wiring. When there is no supervision, the first teacher is whatever numbs you. And if your dad is gone and your mom is asleep half the day, the vacuum gets filled by chaos. Do you think people underestimate how boring neglect can look from the outside? Totally, because it is not always dramatic, it is just absence. The system is not always evil, sometimes it is just nowhere. That is actually a brutal line because it is true. And then the kid becomes the adult too early and starts self-medicating the gap. What I liked is he did not romanticize any of it. He basically says, "I was an addict before the street made it visible." Which is annoyingly precise, because you cannot blame just one villain. Right, it is environment plus wiring plus access plus luck running out. But then the other part that hooked me was the responsibility switch. The whole "take care of your mom" line is devastating. Because love becomes useless if you cannot act on it. That is the part people skip when they tell these stories. It is not just suffering, it is being unable to show up for the one person you still care about. That will crack anybody open if they still have a pulse. And then he says he made a pact with God that he was going to be rich. That is such a wild recovery sentence. Not humble, but extremely effective, apparently. He did not pray for balance, he prayed for an outcome. I actually respect the specificity because vague hope never built anything. But do you think that is healthy or just a different addiction? That is the question, because obsession can clean up or consume. He literally says he worked himself into the dirt day and night. Which makes me think the engine stayed the same, just the destination changed. Exactly, the intensity did not disappear, it got redirected. He just swapped heroin for a calendar and some discipline. That is maybe the least glamorous detox imaginable. But that is probably why it worked, because he was not trying to become a different species. He was trying to become a functional version of the same guy. That is such an important distinction. People want instant personality transplants, and real change is more like channeling water. You ever notice the best reinventions do not erase the old person? They just stop letting the worst parts drive the car. That's a good line, and the old driver was clearly on something. Which is rude to say, but also the whole point. The business number is crazy too, 34 or 35 million. From a guy who was literally on the street, that is just nuts. But the money is almost secondary to the proof of re-entry. What do you mean by re-entry? Like getting back into the real world without needing it to love you back. That is good, Because a lot of people can make money and still never re-enter. They stay emotionally on Skid Row even after they have a penthouse. Rich and spiritually underbridged. That should not be funny, but it is. And he seems unusually good at connecting with important people, too. I think that comes from having nothing to perform with anymore. When you have already lost everything, you stop trying to impress and start being present. That is when people with real power finally relax around you. Because they can smell the fake stuff instantly? Exactly. And addicts in recovery can become weirdly magnetic once the lies stop. Turns out honesty is a networking strategy. That's horrible and true. I also think people hear a success story like this and skip the middle. They want to jump from chaos to outcome without the ugly work. The ugly work is the whole thing. He did not transcend addiction by wishing harder. He built structure. And structure is so unsexy compared to redemption. Completely nobody puts structure on a poster. But structure is just compassion with a schedule. That is actually beautiful, annoyingly so. The scary part is how close this story sits to total collapse. One bad turn, one overdose, and none of this exists. That is why I cannot do the fake inspirational version of it. It is miraculous, but it is also brutal math and timing. Do you think the lesson is more about faith or agency? Both, but only if faith makes you move and agency makes you honest. Otherwise, it is just vibes with a Bible verse. Please, that line is illegal. Still, I get why that pact mattered, because people need a narrative big enough to survive on. And then once the narrative exists, the work can actually begin. Exactly, the story is the spark, not the engine. He had to keep showing up after the miracle feeling wore off. That part is always less glamorous than the testimonial. Way less glamorous, but way more useful. I think that is why this story lands so hard. It says you can be wrecked, self-destructive, ashamed, and still not finished. And the exit starts when you stop lying to yourself for 1 minute. 1 minute is sometimes all a person gets. Then that minute has to count. Which honestly is a terrifyingly adult lesson. Yeah, it is not cute, but it works. That broken flip-flop detail is disgusting and perfect. Like the universe was forcing the audit in broad daylight. And the wild part is he did not have a grand speech, just panic. Which is more honest than all the cinematic rock-bottom stuff. Yeah, no violin music, just dirt and shame and heat. That kind of clarity is brutal because it does not flatter you at all. It is basically, oh, I became the person I used to judge. The mirror showed up and it was not kind. And that is usually the first real recovery moment. Not when you promise tomorrow, but when today becomes unbearable. People act like addicts need a better speech, but they need a better floor. Or less access to chaos, which is very rude to say out loud. Still, I keep thinking about the mother thing. That line, take care of your mom, and I could not, is devastating. Because that is when the fantasy dies and responsibility starts. It is not even about money first. It is about not being able to show up. That hurts deeper than being broke. Way deeper because broke can still be temporary. Being spiritually useless is a nastier diagnosis. Bro, that sentence hit way too hard. But it explains why his turnaround was not motivational poster stuff. It was almost like desperation got disciplined. Yes, that is the real switch, because obsession did not disappear. He just changed the target of it. Instead of chasing the next hit, he started chasing structure. Or chasing redemption, which can be just as intense. Sometimes probably more intense, because now there is guilt fuel. That is the dangerous genius here. The same force that wrecked him became the force that built him. Human beings are basically very committed monkeys with trauma. That is insane, but annoyingly accurate. And I do think people underestimate how much addiction is about intensity. Not just chemicals, but the need to feel something at full volume. Some people do not want peace, they want noise. That is why recovery cannot just be stopping. It has to replace the emotional engine. Otherwise, you just have a vacuum with better furniture. A very expensive vacuum, too. And then there is the weird business angle, which is actually not weird. The same guy saying he worked his body into the dirt is the guy who built an empire. Because recovery people think the world owes them softness, and he did the opposite. He made a pact and then outworked the shame. That is such a hard sentence because it sounds almost too simple. Simple is usually the part people hate because it requires actual effort. People want a hack, not 1,000 ugly days. Also, 34 or 35 million a year is not accidental. That level of output means the obsession became operational. Which raises the uncomfortable question, is this healing or just a better addiction? That is the question, right? Because work can absolutely become a socially praised drug. The difference is whether it is destroying you or building your life. Although sometimes those two are dating for a while. Dating is generous, they are practically married. But I think his answer is in that taking responsibility piece. He was not pretending the old energy was pure, he redirected it. That feels more real than pretending you found enlightenment and now you float. Nobody floats out of that kind of hole. They claw out, then they keep clawing in a different direction. And the moment of asking for help matters more than people admit. Because ego always wants to frame it as self-rescue. Which is hilarious, since self-rescue is usually the trap. Right, the whole thing starts with stopping the performance. Penny and that rehab connection are important because recovery is often borrowed at first. Someone else has to hold the ladder while you stop pretending you are fine. That is not weakness, that is sequence. And maybe that is what people miss when they romanticize transformation. They want the one dramatic sunrise, but it is mostly a lot of gross logistics. Gross logistics is the actual name of recovery. Wake up, call somebody, go somewhere, do the next humiliating thing. Then repeat until your life stops resembling a disaster movie. And if you can keep the same intensity while changing the mission, that is elite. That is why some people become dangerous after recovery in a good way. They know what collapse feels like, so they do not waste time. Fear of hunger becomes a very effective productivity app. Terrible branding, excellent results. The more I think about it, the less I see a clean before and after. It feels like the same person with a different philosophy of pain. One version lets pain consume him, the other lets pain instruct him. That is a very expensive lesson if you learn it late. But maybe late is still better than never. Also, his point about connecting with top people being simple is sneaky. Simple usually means not fake, which most people cannot handle. Everyone wants charisma, but consistency is what gets invited back. That should be printed on a very annoying mug. And it fits the whole story, honestly. He did not magically become a different species, he just got aligned enough to work. That is way more useful than inspiration porn. Because it tells you what to do when you are still a mess. Yeah, not what to feel, what to do. And that distinction is everything. Feelings can come later. Action has to come first. Unfortunately, the feelings are never as efficient as the action plan. Sadly, yes. I think that is why this story actually sticks. It is not saying you are broken forever, it is saying you are responsible now. And responsibility is terrifying, but it is also freedom. The best kind, even if it arrives covered in dirt. That image of the broken flip-flop is insane, because it is such a tiny thing and it carries the whole collapse. Like one shoe failing and suddenly your whole life is basically falling through the floor. Yeah, and the brutal part is, he is not romanticizing it at all. He is saying, no, I was filthy, I was sick, and I had become somebody I did not recognize. That is the part people try to soften, like, maybe he was just having a rough patch. A rough patch does not usually include blood on your hands and crack and heroin. Yeah, that is not a rough patch, that is the abyss with bad footwear. But what gets me is the clarity moment is not him suddenly becoming enlightened. It is more like his brain finally stops lying to him for a second. Like the noise drops and the truth just walks in uninvited. That is actually such a terrifying and powerful sentence. Because the truth is not inspirational at first, it is humiliating. And humiliating is often the first honest thing. Do you think people need that level of shock to change? Or do we just like stories where the bottom is dramatic enough to force a pivot? I think the truth is, most people get smaller warnings before the disaster. They just keep negotiating with themselves until the warnings become a crater. That is such a painful way to put it. But accurate, unfortunately. And his backstory makes the addiction part feel almost inevitable, which is scary. Dad gone, mom sleeping through the day, zero supervision, older kids, weed at 8. That is not a character flaw, that is a pipeline. Exactly. And that matters because people love reducing it to morals. They want a clean villain, a clean victim, and a clean lesson. Real life is messier, and this one starts messier than most people can handle. But I also think that is why his turnaround lands. Because it is not fake redemption, it is earned survival. Yes, and then he says, basically, I made a pact with God that I was going to be rich. That line is so wild because it sounds almost ridiculous until you hear the work behind it. A lot of people say things like that and mean fantasy. He meant obsession with direction. Same engine, different destination. That is actually the whole sermon right there. He did not kill the intensity, he repurposed it. And that is way harder than the usual self-help version of calm down and journal. Right, because some people are not built for calm down and journal. Some people would journal themselves straight back into chaos. The idea is not to erase obsession, it is to aim it, which is maybe why business became the container for him. Though I do always wonder when recovery stories become business stories, if people get a little too enchanted by the outcome. Like, okay, he built a health company, but the deeper win is that he stayed alive and useful. Money is the scoreboard, not the miracle. That is so good, because the million-dollar headline can distract from the actual transformation. The real miracle is that he can look at the same hunger and not let it eat him. And that takes structure, not just inspiration. People always want the spiritual lightning bolt without the boring repetition. They want the montage, not the labor. Unfortunately, life is mostly labor. I also keep thinking about him asking for help from that woman and the free rehab connection. That is such a quiet hinge in the story. One honest ask can do more than 100 fake promises. And that is hard for people because asking means admitting you are not in control. Which honestly, he was not. Not even remotely. But that surrender is not weakness in his framing, it is the first adult move. Like, okay, I cannot outpower this thing, so I'm going to submit to reality. That is the move people hate because it sounds so unglamorous. Reality is always a terrible brand deal. Bro, that is horrible and perfect. And then the mother part hits like a truck. Because suddenly it is not just about him, it is about the pain he caused people who loved him. That is often where real remorse starts, not with self-hatred, but with impact. People think recovery is about feeling sorry for yourself forever. It is usually about seeing who paid the price for your disorder. That is ugly, but it is honest. And it also explains why he sounds so intense about taking responsibility now. Because when you have watched yourself become somebody else's emergency, responsibility feels like oxygen. Oof, that is a line. You can keep it if you want. I am not precious about it. I also think there is something dangerous and beautiful about people with addictive energy. Dangerous when it is aimless, beautiful when it is disciplined. Because they can build things at a speed normal people cannot sustain, and also destroy things at a speed normal people cannot comprehend. Exactly, same hands, different consequences. So the question is not whether the energy is bad. The question is whether the person can learn a container big enough for it. That is what makes this feel bigger than a comeback story. It is a story about learning how to live inside your own intensity without dying from it. That is actually such a brutal skill. Nobody puts that on a motivational poster, because it would sell 0 copies. But it is the real thing, right? The real thing is not becoming a different person overnight. It is becoming a person who can stay when things get hard, which annoyingly is never as cinematic as the collapse. That is the tragedy of growth. It is mostly unsexy consistency. But that is why it matters. Because a guy like that could have stayed a cautionary tale. Instead, he became proof that the story is not over at the worst chapter. And maybe that is the whole point. Not that suffering is noble, but that it is not the final author. If you let somebody else write the ending, they might surprise you. That is a pretty clean ending for something this messy. We should probably ruin it by talking about one more hard thing. What do you think the younger generation gets wrong most about stories like this? Maybe they want the turnaround without the shame or the power without the discipline. They want identity without accounting. That is terrifyingly accurate. And accounting is the whole point, because otherwise the same pattern just keeps coming back with new clothes. Until you look at it, name it, and take responsibility, it owns you. Which is why this story is not really about business at all. It is about becoming governable by your own better self. Damn, that is a very grown-up sentence. I know, I hate that I said it. But it is true. But that Skid Row moment is wild, because it sounds almost small until it isn't. A broken flip-flop, July heat, blood on your hands, and suddenly the whole lie collapses. Not exactly a self-help montage, more like the universe yelling at you. The universe had to go full volume because he was not listening. And what gets me is he did not say he got inspired, he said he got scared. That feels more honest because people change faster when disgust finally beats denial. Inspiration is cute, but terror is what actually moves the furniture. Terror is a stronger executive than motivation. Completely. And he knew exactly who he had become in that moment. That part hurts, because he was looking at himself like a stranger on the street. And the weird thing is, he didn't romanticize it at all. No, he said he was an addict early, abandoned early, and basically unsupervised for years. That childhood setup is like handing someone a spark and then acting shocked when there's a fire. And then everyone wants to act like the fire started mysteriously. Yeah, the seed was there long before the street got him. But I also think that is where people get uncomfortable, because it removes the easy villain. It's not just drugs as a monster from outside, it's the whole life architecture failing. Which is harder to tweet about, obviously. Way harder to sell as a neat lesson, too. And then he says he made a pact with God that he was going to be rich. That line is insane because it sounds delusional and disciplined at the same time. That's the best kind of line, honestly. Wait, do you think that was faith or just a new addiction wearing a nicer suit? Maybe both, but that's the fascinating part. He redirected the compulsive energy instead of deleting it, and that's the part people miss. You do not become a new person by becoming less intense. You become new by aiming the intensity somewhere that does not destroy you. Which is such an annoying answer because everybody wants a shortcut. There is no shortcut, only a more acceptable obsession. That's actually brutal. But when he says he worked his body into the dirt, that sounds like the same engine again. Exactly, except now the engine is hauling groceries instead of wrecking the car. Hauling groceries is such a beautiful way to describe recovery. Because recovery is not becoming soft, it is becoming useful. And useful is underrated, honestly. We worship talent and ignore the boring people who just keep showing up. But consistency is what rebuilt him, not some magical personality transplant. Imagine if every comeback story was actually just a calendar app. Seriously, alarms, routines, showing up, repeat. And then there is the mother piece, which is where it stops being cool fast. That he cried because his mom had cancer and he could not take care of her is devastating. That is the real rock bottom inside the rock bottom. Because addicts can lie to everybody except the person they wanted to protect. Yeah, when the damage spills onto your mother, the whole fantasy collapses. Do you think shame helps at that point, or does it just keep you stuck longer? Shame can be useful for about 6 seconds, and then it becomes a trap. Great motivational tool, terrible life strategy. That's exactly it. Responsibility is cleaner than shame because responsibility tells you what to do next. And that is probably why he keeps emphasizing surrender instead of self-hatred. Surrender is not giving up, it's admitting you are not the boss anymore. It's the first honest sentence a lot of people ever say. After that, everything gets a little less cinematic and a lot more real. And that's probably why his business story lands, because it is not separate from the recovery story. Right, the company is basically proof of a changed operating system. Changed operating system is so corporate but annoyingly correct. Because before, the software was built to chase immediate relief. Then he retrained it toward delayed reward, discipline, and service. And service matters more than people admit, especially for men who need a reason beyond themselves. If you only live for yourself, your life gets very small very fast. Yeah, once he had to show up for something bigger, the energy had somewhere to land. Otherwise, it just starts chewing on the walls again. That's a very polite way to describe relapse. I also keep thinking about how he could talk to powerful people later. Because if you've survived chaos, rich rooms stop intimidating you as much. Also, nothing scares a boardroom like someone who has literally been at the bottom and can smell nonsense. Smell nonsense is elite phrasing, but it's true. Trauma can make you weirdly good at reading the room. Do you think that is why his whole advice to younger people feels so simple? Probably because once you've lived the extreme version, the answer shrinks down to basics. Stop lying, ask for help, work hard, and do not outsource your life. That is less glamorous than people want, but it's the truth. The truth is usually terrible for branding. Still sells better than fantasy in the long run. And that's why this story works, because it never pretends the pain was poetic. It just says the pain was real, and then something useful was built on top of it. Which is maybe the most adult version of hope there is. Yeah, hope with receipts. Hope with receipts is crazy. But I like that more than inspirational fluff. Same. because it makes the transformation feel earned instead of magical. And earned stories always hit harder,